Welcome back to another episode of Data Driven Recruiting. Today, we're talking about how companies can leverage data to increase the top of the funnel.
Yeah. Well, we've been in the HR tech space for several years, and one of the things that we hear from the companies is that they have a hard time increasing their top of the funnel.
Right. It's literally like one of the number one things everybody says, right?
Right. But then we also see that there are more and more people going into the tech industry, and more people are actually in the job market.
Right.
So why there is such a paradox of one side feeling that there isn't enough, and
Right.
then the other side actually increasing in number.
Right. It's kind of weird, right? So like on the one side, they say there's more people rushing into technology space and more people getting CS degrees and more people applying for jobs than ever, and there's boot camps and there's so many people in this space and it keeps increasing. And on the other hand, you talk to companies and they're like, we can't find enough candidates. The top of the funnel is the biggest problem we have. And I think there is a pretty simple explanation. And the simple explanation is that companies are still stuck in the old way of doing recruiting. And the old way of doing recruiting is that you just look at a resume. If the resume has some of those keywords that you expect to see, that you're used to seeing, and then you move forward with them. If it doesn't, you just reject them. So what ends up happening, it's like more than 90%, sometimes even 95, 97% of all applicants that come through the door just get rejected outright. Look at the resume.
From
Doesn't
the
look
very
good.
beginning.
From the very beginning.
Yeah.
And then obviously, if you keep doing that, you're just not going to have enough candidates and you're going to keep saying that, well, top of the funnel is the biggest problem we have. And I guess the reason that this old way no longer works, and it used to work, right? So it's not like this never worked. I think 30 years ago, if you didn't go to a top school and if you didn't work at a well-known company, it was reasonable to expect that, for example, when it comes to computer programming, you probably didn't have really strong computer programming skills because where were you going to learn, right? So like if you
Right.
didn't end up going to one of the schools that was teaching this or worked at a company where somebody could be your mentor and teach you, internet wasn't around. So you
Right.
couldn't hop on the...
Yeah, and then everybody had to kind of all in on getting to that school,
Right.
getting to that company,
Right.
if you ever want to be in that industry at all.
Exactly.
Right?
So it was natural for people to use that proxy as a way to gauge talent, but that's been changing and it's been changing very fast. And it's been a 30-year change since the internet started gaining legs and more online resources became available for learning. Nowadays, it's a complete different story.
Right. It's like the 2016 Stack Overflow survey says something like 69% of the developers
Right.
are at least partially self-taught, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
which is an insane number if you think about it, right? 69% being partially self-taught, and I think more than 50% are completely self-taught, not even
Right.
partially, right?
Right.
So if you think about it, it's like more than half of the people, uh, and not even a related degree. So it's like no CS degree and not even a related, not math, not physics, right? So
Right.
if you look at their resume, you're like, who's this person?
Yeah, and I mean that also makes sense. Like the internet being so widespread is one, but also the technology has been evolving so fast
Right.
that you cannot learn all that in CS classes and universities, and
Exactly.
people have to figure out how to teach themselves those latest and newest technology.
And it's
Yeah.
and technology with the evolution of technology, the universities have been lacking behind in big ways. So like it usually takes about 10 years for a university to adopt what they
Right.
teach in classes, and that also leads to like a lot of people at least being partially self-taught when it comes to technologies. I can give you an example. Like at MIT, uh, only recently in the past decade or something, they started teaching Python as the main language. Before that, they were teaching Lisp, and no one has been using Lisp in the
In the
industry
industry.
for the past 20 years or so.
Right,
So
right.
it takes a lot of time for that message to get delivered to
Right,
schools
and then change the
learning to
curriculum and the whole new classes and preparation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's so many beautiful stories of this. Like I was in one of the Go Beyond Resumes videos recently, I was talking about the creator of Vue.js. And Vue.js is one of the most popular JavaScript frameworks in the whole world. And Evan You, the guy who created it, he doesn't have a CS degree, nothing related. I think he did art history, and then he just picked up programming as a hobby about 8 years ago. And today, the framework that he ended up creating is like literally one of the most popular JavaScript frameworks used
Right.
out there.
And he wouldn't have been found in this traditional way of recruiting people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
So I think, just to answer your question of what has changed, right? Education has changed, and recruiting hasn't been changing as fast as it should have. And if you think about the relationship between education and recruiting, education is how you acquire skills, and recruiting is how we, look for those skills and recruit for those skills.
Yeah.
And the way we acquire skills and the way we find people who have those skills are in this weird relationship where they have to be evolving together, and education has been evolving much faster than the recruiting
has.
space. Yeah.
Got it.
So I guess, the main question that people are going to ask is like, how are we supposed to adapt, right?
Yeah. How can companies, adapt to this new world?
Mm-hmm.
How can they use data to actually catch up and even have an edge and competitive edge?
Yeah, if you think about it, I mean, there is one real way, which is like if you think about here, all of these people who have the skill, we've been using a proxy called education and pedigree, and that proxy no longer works. So what do? Do we go and try to find a different proxy, or do we do something else? So trying to find a different proxy has been popular, right? So people have been trying to find proxies such as let's look at a GitHub profile, let's look at a Stack Overflow profile, and let's try to use that as a proxy.
Of how well they can program.
Exactly,
Okay.
right? So like what are their technical skills? And it hasn't been working as well, mainly because just like the resumes, right? When the resumes initially came out, it was working decently well. But like something like a GitHub profile can be easily faked, right? So like I can just copy somebody else's code, put into my GitHub profile, and all of a sudden it looks shiny. So using that data as a signal for somebody's qualified or not, and as soon as you start, when people just started doing it, it was working fine because candidates hadn't caught on to like what's going on.
Right.
As soon as everybody started realizing, oh, people look at my GitHub profile,
Right.
all of a sudden all GitHub profiles became much better.
Yeah.
Because
And also it's difficult to scale. Like it's somebody who's very technical, so
Right.
usually an engineer from the team needs to review
Right.
the GitHub and see how good this person is.
Exactly.
Right?
And you're
Yeah.
only seeing the end state. You're not seeing the process, and
Right.
you're not seeing any data around like
Yeah,
how
or
they
thought
arrived at that
process.
point.
How did you try to solve the problem and why you chose this particular
Exactly.
solution? Yeah.
Exactly. So at Code Signal, we've been always advocating for, you know what, it's possible to measure things directly. You don't need to rely on proxies, right? Like proxies are decent, but most of the time they lead you astray. And even if you do find a decent initial proxy, over time it just becomes outdated.
Yeah.
And fortunately, skill, especially something like software engineering and hard skills, are directly measurable. It's like, lifting a weight. If you can lift this weight, I will just ask you to lift it instead of asking for some data on your resume around like when have you lifted it before.
Yeah.
So I think
So a lot more direct and accurate.
exactly.
Yeah, the correlation between you being able to do well on this and then actually having that technical skill is much, much clearer
Exactly.
than looking at other
Exactly.
evidences.
So
So, well, one thing I want to ask you is like I've also heard some pushbacks around that idea, like measuring technical skills. I mean, some people argue that measuring like technical skills is not everything that we are trying to evaluate in a candidate, and some of the people mention that they look for like good schools and pedigrees because that also kind of indicates that there are other attributes that can make this person a high-performing employee later on. And specifically what I hear is like ambition or drive. And if they were able to work hard to get into those schools, then you have that ambition as your attribute.
Yeah, it's a good question. I've heard that pushback too. It's I think it's more of a confirmation bias and more of an excuse than a real fact. Because just to kind of share a little anecdote, in the most recent Go Beyond Resumes video with the former head of engineering recruiting at Google, we were talking about how they conducted an experiment in which they said, hey, we've been hiring everybody from Stanford and Harvard and MIT, and maybe it's time for us to branch out and see how kind of engineers from other schools do compared to all of this pedigree talent that we've got in house. And this is the early days of Google where they, you know, they were sort of more open to like doing experiments and trying and failing.
Yeah.
And what happened, what Carrie was sharing, is that they went to some second and third tier schools and they tried to, obviously they didn't have a way back then to measure talent directly, so they found a proxy. It was still a decent proxy. They asked professors, like, how, can you tell us some of your like best students from these unknown schools?
Yeah.
And if you think about it, that's pretty ingenious because like professors usually know because they've been working with the students over time. They've been giving them exams and checking their homework, so they have some sort of an understanding of who are the top students.
Right.
And according to Carrie, they made quite a good number of hires out of that experiment, and they actually tracked the performance of those that came from these non-pedigree schools, and their impact at the company, and the ones that had the pedigree. And they were able to show that they did even better, right? So when it came to performance, when it came to measuring the impact on the company, they did even better than all of the pedigree talent. And you can argue of like the many reasons, one being having a chip on their shoulder and having something to prove compared to those who already have the highly decorated resumes. And it could be something else. But, you know, that's one of the rare experiments where people actually did it and they saw the opposite and not what people tend to believe.
It at least like proves that, you know, hiring people without pedigree doesn't actually hurt you. It could actually benefit you because they could be a better performer.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a very impressive experiment and the results.
Right. Yeah. And the bottom line, again, is that the way you use data is by measuring talent directly at the very, very top of the funnel. So like resumes are not a reliable form of data. The reliable form of data is like direct measurement of skill. Right. Measure my skill directly, see what can I do, and then leverage that as a way to move forward in the process. And that's kind of how you increase the top of the funnel.
Thanks for the insight, and thanks everyone for watching and listening. This is all for today, and we will see you next week.